everyone. It's great to see everyone here. I see, wow, we have almost 500 people. That's amazing. So hopefully I'll give you some good information tonight. Before we get started, I'm gonna just introduce myself. My name is Rebecca Chabro. I am currently the Director of College Counseling at Linden Hall, which is the country's oldest all-girls boarding school. Before that, I've worked in a variety of school settings, pretty much every type of school setting you can imagine. I've worked in public schools, international schools, boarding schools, still working in boarding school, religious schools, now working in all girls schools. So an IB world school. So I have AP and IB experience. So I have a pretty good understanding of the school environments and then also obviously the admissions landscape. So, all right, let's get started. So this year has been a little bit of a crazy year, but not as crazy as last year. So that's good. It's calming down a little, as I hope we can all feel. So let me share my screen. I realized I have my presentation up, but I don't have the screen shared. All right, everyone see the 2021, 2022? Yes. Okay, perfect. All right. All right, so Debbie, I don't know if you wanted to just do a little plug for the program.
Yes.
Sorry, you for that.
That's okay. We share a ton of free information, but for those people who want a little bit more extra support, we have a program called Concierge, Rhodes College Concierge, and it's been going on for several years. Rebecca is one of the what we call counselors in residence, and we do several, I was going to say, I can't even, like maybe 3 to 6, depending what the topics are, different live sessions every month. We have a private Facebook group. So we're there to really support families a little bit more tightly than, just what happens in the Paying for College 101 world. And tonight is just really just one example of the types of sessions that we have multiple times a month. During those sessions, you can ask lots of questions. You can ask questions after a session anytime through the Facebook group. So we've really helped a lot of families focus on the process. That we kind of teach the process. They then know what to do with their own students. Sometimes the student sits in on sessions. But anyhow, we know that this is the time of year when junior families are starting to think, like, should I be like, getting a little bit more extra help to get through the next few months? And it depends on what type of family you are and kind of how much effort you want to put into it yourself. I am all for people doing it on their own. I mean, this is really a version of a do-it-yourself help, because we don't do it for you. We're just kind of there a little bit more, supportively for you. Anyhow, if you're interested in joining, we are giving a special deal, and we'll send you the information later, and you'll see it at the end. But you can join tonight and only for the next few days. It's called at rhodescollege.com/concierge, and you can use the bonus 30. But just so wanted to give you guys a heads up that what you're learning tonight is just a tidbit of the types of stuff that we go through multiple times a month.
Yeah, and just one thing I didn't mention about my background, but I also worked for an independent college counseling company in the DC area that charged $750 an hour. So really high-end clientele, high expectations, and I learned best practices there, which I have since implemented in my jobs as a college counselor at a school. And for those of you who are in public school environments, college counselors are really a private school job, where I have, instead of a school counselor's caseload of 500 students or 250 students on a good day, I have, maybe 30 seniors each year. And so that allows me to, and my job only focuses on college counseling. So I've been able to take those best practices and implement them into my practice. And what I do is, because I realize, and one thing I love about Road to College is because most schools, especially public schools, don't have a college counselor, I'm essentially able to teach you the things that I teach my students. And so instead of having to go out or enroll in a private school or go out and get an independent college counselor, you can come to Road to College for a fraction of the cost, do the concierge program, and get all the same guidance and advice. All right. So I'm going to move on. So tonight we're going to talk about a few different things. We're going to first go over application trends since pre-COVID to now, see how things have changed because things have changed so drastically in the past 2 years. Then we're going to review the early decision and early action results that have been published. Not everything is published, but of what's been published, we have some of the results. Then we're going to go over the class of 2026. So this year's seniors are going to be the college seniors of 2026. We're going to go over the admissions data that's come in so far. This is incomplete simply because half the really selective schools haven't even released their decisions yet. I know the Ivies are coming out with their decisions on March 31st. I think I saw Barnard's tomorrow, and then there are a few that are going to trickle into April. And so this is incomplete. I think we're probably going to have a similar session maybe sometime in May to cover all of the data once we've been able to synthesize it all. But for now, we'll show you what has come out up until yesterday. And then we're going to talk about implications for rising seniors. That's you juniors right there. And then finish off with some words of wisdom that we saw posted in a college admissions counselor Facebook group that really, I just think gives a little solace to all the craziness of numbers you're going to see here tonight. All right, so let's look at those application trends first, see how things have, changed. So since prior to COVID, there's been a 14.4 increase in distinct applicants. So there's been an increase, there's actually been more people applying to college than before. And this can be attributed to, probably in large part to a lot of schools going test optional and people becoming more, having colleges seem more accessible to the broader population. So there's 14.48% increase. As you can see, the bigger increase was last year, the first year admission cycle of COVID. There was a 7.5% increase. It still has increased almost at the same rate, 6.4%, not quite as high, but still steadily increasing. So that's a good thing. More people are applying to college. The growth in applicants tends to be across the United States, except for New England and Mid-Atlantic. Those tend to be very, densely populated, highly educated areas that I think already had a lot of application numbers, but people from more rural areas around the country are applying more to college. So that is a good thing. International applications have also increased, actually at 2 to 3 times the rate of domestic applicants. So last year it was a little under 2%. I think it was around 12% or so. And this year it jumped. And I think that's in large part due to the borders opening up. So there's been actually a 20% increase in international applications this year. So that's almost that's over 3 times the amount of the rate of domestic applicants. So there are a lot more international students applying than previously. And I think that's in part due to the fact that we, do have so much open because of COVID. A lot of schools have a lot of countries have a lot more restrictions. I'm seeing that with my own students. I have a large international population at my school, and what they talk about how things are back home is way more strict than it is here in the United States. So I think that openness has been encouraging more applicants. And with more applicants comes more applications. So there's been overall in the past 2 years, a 21.3% increase in applications. So that's a huge increase. That's a fifth more applications than there were prior. That increase has slowed down a little. It was 11.2% in that first year and 9.1% this past cycle. So things are slowing down. I think as things are going back to normal, it's slowed down, but part of that increase and the continued increase at almost the same level is in part due to the uncertainty that more application numbers bring. The more applications, the lower acceptance rates. And then the lower the acceptance rates, the more uncertainty of the outcome and the more application students think they need to submit. And it's cyclical and it's really become a big problem. You can see overall, it doesn't look like, the average applicants per person or applications per applicant has risen 0.32, but that ends up being a 6% increase overall. So that is significant. when you look at applications to private schools or public schools, the majority of applications are to private schools. There's a lot of really small private schools in the country, but more so than that, a lot of applications go, as you can see down here, 26% of the applications go to the more highly selective schools with under 50% admit rate. And if you were to break that down even further, the amount of applications that go to the top, 50, 100 colleges with acceptance rates under 30, 20, 10 is even higher. So the higher the lower the acceptance rate, the more applications that these schools are getting. And so that also attributes to a lot of the more selective schools tend to be private schools. So there's 59% of the apps go there to the private schools, 41% are going to public schools, but the increase, if you look over time, there's more students applying. The increase has been more drastic with students applying to public school than private school. And that's in large part because, people, especially after COVID, are looking for more affordable options. And for the most part, especially in-state public schools, are those affordable options. All right. So that was data, previously was data from the Common Application. So for those of you who don't know, the Common Application is an application that has hundreds of schools. I think it's like over 900 or something at this point. And they're typically the ones that are going to be on your national radar, the ones that people are applying to from other states, and then the bigger name schools in your state, unless they're part of systems like the UT system or the University of California system. There's some state systems that have their own applications. So those were the Common App numbers. The University of California also publishes numbers, and it's been interesting to see that they have increased 22.5% applications system-wide. So even more so than the general population, the University of California schools have gotten more applications. That being said, if you look, you can see that the increases are at higher rates to the more selective schools. So some numbers just to explain all these crazy numbers here. You see the admit rates up top, and you can see the difference, the admit rate for the 2 cycles that we have admit rates for already. We don't have admissions rates for this current cycle yet. Acceptances have been sent out, but the acceptance rates have not been published. But you can see that the schools with the lower acceptance rates tend to have the highest gains in applications. So UCLA has the lowest acceptance rate. They had 37.6% increase in applications over the last 2 years. Berkeley had a 45.6% increase in applications, which should be really interesting considering they are now this year, news came out that they're going to be accepting significantly thousands fewer applicants than before due to their local community not wanting as many students and college buildings and things in the area. So that should be really interesting. Their acceptance rate should probably be much, much lower than previous years, in part because of that. Increased applications, but much lower acceptance rate for Berkeley this year. But as you can see, this kind of holds true with what we saw the data in the previous slide, where the more selective colleges have a higher increase in applications, and the less selective colleges. So you can see Merced, that's the University of California's least selective campus, has only seen a 6.8% increase in applications. So while overall colleges are seeing that increase, the more highly selective colleges are seeing that bigger increase. So one thing, and we'll say it again later, but if you want to kind of calm your nerves a little, make sure that you have some likely and target options that you like and are excited about, because these schools that are selective are just getting more selective. All right, so going back to the Common Application, just some other trends to look at. Underrepresented populations have increased over the past 2 years, which is good. I mean, there's been a lot of talk for years in college admissions over equity and access, and the TestOptional movement has been one that's been really fighting for that, because standardized tests have been found to not be equitable, not be fair to lower income, first generation students, underrepresented minorities. And COVID kind of forced a lot of schools into the test optional space. And as a result, there's been an increase in these applicants. Although, as you can see, for the underrepresented minority applicants and the fee waiver applicants, it's actually less of an increase than the general population, the total general population. So that is somewhat concerning. Underrepresented minorities, for those of you who do not know the term, includes, in college admissions purposes, Black or African American students, Latino, Hispanic students, Native American students. It does not include Asian students with it. So when we're talking about underrepresented minorities, it's different than simply saying minority. But you can see for first generation applicants, there has been a 22% increase. So that is consistent with the increase in applicants as the increase in applicants. So that is good. In terms of zip code and socioeconomics, looking into that a little bit more, 56% of domestic applicants reside in the top 20 wealthiest zip codes. And that's that's 56% of the applicants, but only 25.7% of the total population resides in those zip codes. So it's definitely not proportionate. While on the other side of things, 6% of domestic applicants reside in the 20 poorest zip codes. And so 6% is not nearly equal to the 15.8% of the population that actually lives in those areas. So you can see there is still a long ways to go with trying to, get equity and get those, make college admissions and applications more accessible to those students, especially in those bottom 2 quintiles of zip codes. Test optional. So as I've talked about test optional a few times, for those of you who don't know the official definition, it means that the college will review your application and not require standardized tests. So before, there were not nearly as many schools that were test optional. Now only 5% of schools actually require standardized tests, which is down from 11% last year. So COVID really pushed a lot of schools into test optional, and the trend has continued. So the University of Georgia, the Georgia Public Schools system, they actually just came out this past week and said that all of their schools, except for their 3 most selective, are going test optional. They were one of two or three states that were holdouts on test optional. Florida still is one, but Georgia has said now, other than our 3 most selective, we are going test optional. So even though a lot of schools, most schools went test optional, there are more that are continuing to go test optional. We'll talk a little bit later about a few that are going back on what they said with test optional now, but for now, test optional has been a big trend. And so when they aren't considering test scores, they just consider all the other factors more. And one of the things that you'll get out of the concierge service is we do pretty much all of the different factors that are considered in admissions, whether it be the essay or the interview or the letters of recommendations. We do workshops on all of those and kind of teach you how you can control the narrative as much as possible, how you can control that aspect of the application as much as possible. And yes, even letters of recommendation, which you are not able to read, you can control. We just did a workshop on it. And I know that Debbie posts all those workshops, all the previous recordings for concierge members. So that is something you can access. So with test optional, all these other factors within holistic admissions, looking at the whole student, become more important. So after one thing though that is interesting, even though the amount of SATs or the amount of test optional schools has increased even since last year, the amount of students reporting test scores has actually increased as well. So I think a lot of students found, and you'll see in the data, that strong test scores at these test optional schools still is advantageous. There is a higher acceptance rate for students submitting test scores than not submitting test scores, and we'll review that data a little bit later on. Another thing just to mention, because it's written here, test blind. For those of you who don't know what that is, that's when a school does not even, they won't even consider the standardized test scores if you send them. So for example, the University of California system is probably the most famous example of that. schools that went test blind. And so even if you had a perfect 1600 or a 36 on the ACT and sent it to them, it would not help you because they will not even consider it. Cal State recently went test blind. I know Reed College is test blind. Those are some of the big names that are test blind. All right. So now that we've talked about the trends of the last 2 years, let's talk about this cycle. What are the results of this cycle? So the results that we actually have more comprehensive data for are the early decision, early action results. For those of you who don't know, early decision and early action generally have November deadlines, and you will typically apply by November and find out your results by usually before the holidays, before Christmas and New Year's. Early decision is binding. So if you submit an application through early decision, you are promising that you will attend if you're accepted. And that is beneficial to the college in multiple ways. We discuss early decision in more detail in our workshops. Early action, you apply early, but it's not binding. So you still find out earlier, but you don't have to attend that school. You can still keep your options open. Compare financial aid offers. Sometimes there's an advantage to applying early action, sometimes there's not. So early decision, let's go talk about that first. So here is a graph of the data that's been reported. There are more schools that have submitted. As you can see, there's a few, Emory, Barnard, Johns Hopkins, who didn't necessarily report data last year. But I tried to include 3 years worth of data since we've been talking about, how things have been since before COVID, with the application numbers. So overall, early decision applications increased at highly selective colleges, but varied by how much. So these are just the application numbers. So you can see that overall, generally, other than Duke, for some reason, their application numbers dropped this year for early decision. And actually Columbia's dropped a little bit this year, but it's still higher than it used to be. And Penn as well. All of the colleges have increased really by over almost over 20% over the last 2 years. So if you look at this year's application numbers compared to 2 years ago, early decision numbers or the application numbers, there's been significant increases in early decision. And that's in large part because there's so much uncertainty with COVID that those who could apply early decision chose to do so because it kind of gives a little bit of a leg up, and any advantage is helpful when there's so many more applications.
And you know what, Rebecca, we don't have on this slide, which would be interesting to update, is of these schools, what percentage of the class do they take early decision? So a lot of these schools, and I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I probably know the range, take a significant number, probably 45% and above, maybe even up to 60%.
I'd say all of these schools probably take at least 40 to 45% of their entire freshman class from early decision. And early decision is a much smaller applicant pool. So it definitely provides an advantage. I will say that sometimes the early decision numbers aren't as transparent as they might seem, because early decision numbers, especially the early decision 1 round for schools that break it up between 1 and 2, include all of the recruited athletes who have lower admissions criteria generally because they're wanted by coaches. Also might include legacies or high donors, people with connections, and so with significant connections. But that being said, if you took all those people out, the early decision acceptance rates would still be higher, just not quite as dramatic as you normally would see.
But it'd be interesting to see also the trend over the past even 3 years of if that percentage of how many they admit of the class early has increased. I think it probably has. It's inching up.
Yeah, and that's definitely something maybe we can include for our next workshop.
I agree.
Next Facebook live event. I also found actually today a new data source. Debbie knows I love data that really makes it easier to track yield. And so that might be something to look at as well. But College Insights does that as well. Mm-hmm. So that's good. So yeah, as you can see here, overall, all colleges saw that increase in early decision applications. And really, other than Duke, Penn, Dartmouth, and Columbia saw decreases in ED applications for this cycle, but not really significant. Duke, for some reason, was the anomaly. It was a little bit more significant than the others. All right. And then early action numbers. So early action numbers increased at highly selective colleges, but varied by how much. So these are the colleges that have presented their early action data. Most colleges saw that increase for the class of 2025. Actually, all of them saw the increase. There have been a few decreases this past year. And those tend to be at, so the Yale, Harvard, and MIT. So Yale and Harvard have restrictive early action. And that could have been something where, you know, maybe people wanted more of that certainty. So then maybe they applied somewhere else, early decision, because with early single choice early action or restrictive early action, you only have to, you apply early. There might be some advantage, but not typically as much of an advantage as there is for early decision. And then you are not committed to them. So that's why there's maybe not as much of an advantage. So those schools did see a slight drop, but they also, if you look at those schools, so Yale had a 37% increase last year. So the bigger increases, Harvard had a 57%, MIT had 61%. So they had much more significant increases last year. So they had a slight decrease, but they're still overall at a very strong increase.
Oh, wait, Rebecca, sorry, can you go back for a second? The one thing I just, sorry, and I don't know if you were saying it, I was answering questions, so I wasn't listening completely, but the one thing, and I know you wrote it on top or not, oh, okay, was about Northeastern, or maybe you have another slide later about Northeastern.
Yeah, I wrote it on another slide later about Northeastern because they're the regular decision numbers.
Yeah.
Northeastern's been a fascinating case study. They didn't release their early action numbers last or 2 years ago, so I don't have the data for early action, but I do for regular decisions have some interesting data, which I'm going to talk about when we get to Northeastern later.
Yeah, but the one thing I wanted to point out, which, you know, I'm paying more attention to, quite honestly, is that what happens in one admission season affects the next admission season.
Absolutely.
And I don't think we don't necessarily talk about it enough, but we should, you know, and I think that Northeastern is the prime example, and you'll talk about it later, but basically what happened last year's admissions cycle impacted what's happening this year. Yeah. So something to think about.
I have a theory that it was strategic.
Okay, could be, but
we'll talk about that later. Okay. So early decision results. So there's a lot of data here, so let me try to help you out with this. So overall, increased applications led to lower admit rates, which makes sense because if there's more applications, but generally the same amount of spots, there's not going to be as many spaces available. That being said, so last year, everyone's acceptance rates dropped, although some did accept more students, especially with all the uncertainty last year. There were definitely schools that wanted to accept more early decision to lock in more students. You could see that especially happened with Boston College, Boston University, maybe ones that aren't quite as highly ranked as the other schools, but still they maintained a lower acceptance rate. And then this past year, other than Duke and BC, which Duke, I said, I don't know, I don't understand quite why they had so much fewer applicants this year. But other than Duke and BC, overall for the 2 years, there's been a decrease in acceptance rates by quite a significant amount. Boston College, my guess is because of all of these schools, they're probably the lowest ranked. Or one of the lowest ranked, that they're competing with these schools for applicants. And so they wanted to accept more in early decision. So I can see why their numbers would potentially go up. But yeah, okay. So then with early action, this pretty much across the board led to overall decrease in acceptance rates over the last 2 years, because once again, more applicants, not necessarily more spaces, leads to lower acceptance rates. With Northeastern, you can see that they we don't have necessarily the numbers of the other data for Northeastern, but of the amount that were admitted this year, there were much fewer in the early action round, and early action isn't binding. So they're not, if they want to solidify a student to come to them, they don't have to accept them early action. Early decisions, what matters more. So that's just some interesting data there. And so the restrictive early action, the single choice acceptance rates rose slightly at Harvard and Yale this year, though the number of admits largely stayed the same due to fewer applications. All right. So early decision 1 versus early decision 2, does it make a difference? And really, there's not enough data. The only schools that have reported the breakdown of early decision 1 and early decision 2 are these 3 schools. And as you can see by the last 2 columns here, the acceptance rates aren't necessarily consistent. So at Johns Hopkins and Boston College, they actually had higher acceptance rates during the early decision 2 round. Early decision 2 is generally a second chance at early decision in January. Sometimes what they'll do is they'll send letters out to the regular decision applicants who submitted early enough and say, would you like to switch your application over to early decision? It could be advantageous, get some more applicants. And this is really a way to lock in some numbers. So early decision 2, you could see with Johns Hopkins was really significantly higher. But if you look, the overall early decision rate is 27%. So you can see there's clearly a lot more early decision applicants in the early decision 1 pool than the early decision 2 pool. Emory, on the other hand, is kind of the opposite. They have, their early decision 1 acceptance rate was 32%, 14% for early decision 2. So both are advantageous and higher than their regular decision acceptance rates, but still not consistent. So should you apply early decision 1 or early decision 2? I would say look at the school's data previously if they report it.
Rebecca, can you just give a quick clarification for what ED1 is versus ED2?
So early decision 1 is the application, like I said, the binding application. In November, you find out in mid to late December if you've been accepted. If you get accepted, then you are bound to attend that college. You have signed a contract saying you will attend. Parents and counselors sign it as well. If you don't get accepted, or if you just early decision, or if you decided not to apply early decision anywhere and then want to later on, there's early decision 2. Not every school has it. Of all the schools that have early decision, maybe about a third have early decision 2, although it's becoming more popular because let's say you are applying to, Emory early decision 1 and you don't get in. Well, now Emory's out of the question. You want a similar size school. Maybe you'll think of Johns Hopkins and apply early decision 2 because look, their early decision 2 acceptance rate was 60% last year or this past year. So that's a second chance for you to get that advantage of applying early decision. And generally you'll find out in February or so. I had a student apply early decision 2 to Wellesley this year and got in, and in February was like, great, I'm done. I don't have to worry about anything else. This is amazing. So it's definitely a really good option, especially at schools that meet full need, which all of these schools do, because if you figure out what your family's expected family contribution is, the amount that the government and the schools expect that you'll be able to pay, if you feel like that's affordable, then the colleges will, especially these top tier schools, will give you financial aid that will cover the difference between what you can afford and their total cost. So if you can afford your expected family contribution, then applying early decision can be advantageous in applying to those highly selective schools, and you could rest assured that you will be able to afford it. So that's good. That being said, if your expected family contribution is higher than you feel like you could pay, sometimes the government doesn't consider things that you wish they would consider with your finances, then you shouldn't apply early decision because you're going to want to balance the financial aid offers and weigh the different financial aid offers. And I know that Debbie has a lot of different workshops regarding financial aid that are included in the Concierge service.
But one thing that you're noticing, you know, kind of understanding all the numbers related to early action, early decision 1, early decision 2, is that it is important to, you know, make a strategy about, you know, it's an application decision or deadline strategy. So it is going to impact your students' results potentially if they apply early someplace, if they apply even rolling, you know, and do it early to get in an application, if they apply, you know, ED2, all of these things, you know, are a piece of the puzzle and impact, you know, the end results. So that's why it's important to learn all this now, do your research now and lay it out. So kind of like before everyone's in the heat of getting the work done.
Yeah. So yeah, as we're talking about, early decision can be an advantage. You know, it allows the college to better predict their yield. So here's another term that we use a lot. Yield is the percentage of students that the college accepts that decide to enroll. Ultimately, colleges are a business and they need to fill their seats. And so they want to make sure that, you know, they have an accurate predictor as to how many students will attend. They're always going to accept more students than they can enroll, knowing that some will not go to them, but the goal is to have higher yields. So early decision helps with that. Like I said before, early decision applicants are reviewed in a smaller applicant pool, but those ED numbers advantages are typically inflated. So as you can see here, you know, we have the University of Virginia, and the University of Virginia is very clear that they should, you know, when looking at their numbers, you should always consider in-state and out-of-state, and for good reason. As you can see, the in-state acceptance rate is almost twice that of the out-of-state acceptance rate. And that's because, you know, they owe it to their citizens to educate their citizens. And so I know a lot of other selective public schools, University of Michigan, University of Florida, University of North Carolina, those top public schools definitely have higher, much higher acceptance rates, or much higher acceptance rates for their in-state students than their out-of-state students. And that translates over to the early decision acceptance rates with Virginia as well. So you can see that there is a 9.7% advantage for applying early decision if you're out of state. There's even more, you know, a 10.8% advantage for applying in-state. So with both, you know, there is an advantage for applying early decision, but more so for those in-state students. With Boston College, overall, it's an 11%, you know, 0.6% increase advantage, but because we looked at the early decision 1 and 2 numbers, a slight, you know, bit more for early decision 2. So you can see these numbers here and how across the board, there still is an advantage to applying early decision. What I will say is when looking at early decision numbers compared to overall numbers, first of all, realize that you're looking at the overall numbers, which includes the early decision. College Insights actually breaks it down and takes out the regular decision number, so you can really see what the regular decision acceptance rate is. Most often, what's reported is the overall acceptance rate, not the regular decision. So you can assume that if you apply regular decision, the acceptance rate is actually lower. So all of these schools, these numbers under overall acceptance rate is not the acceptance rate that you are going to be looking at if you apply regular decision. It is actually lower than that. But something just to note, sorry, going back, with the early decision advantage is that you can probably assume at the smaller colleges, so like Williams, that advantage is going to be more skewed or more inflated than at the larger schools, simply because, you know, while yes, larger schools are going to have more athletic teams, the athletic teams typically are going to, they're not going to have that many more athletic teams, and the athletic teams typically have the same amount of players that need to be recruited, no matter what the size of the school. And so at a smaller school, a higher percentage of the early decision students are going to be those recruited athletes than at larger schools. Okay, deferrals. Very few colleges, you know, colleges overall in general, I think you can see are not the most transparent about their admissions data, but about deferral rates, definitely not so much. So these are the deferral rates that were published. As you can see, half of them are University of Virginia, but like I said before, they're very adamant that you need to report in-state and out-of-state separately. And of course, because they have early decision and early action, I've separated those out as well. So you can look at the deferral rates. Oftentimes, you know, it depends on the school. They're really inconsistent. And I know Harvard's not listed here, but Harvard defers almost any student that's admissible, whereas Yale defers only a third of students. So it really depends school to school. It's not consistent. But one thing that is interesting to see is that if you are deferred, and deferred means you are not accepted in the early round, but you are going to be reconsidered in the regular decision round. So you're going to get, you know, a full review in the regular decision round. But the thing is that if you weren't strong enough to be accepted the first time, chances are you're probably not going to be strong enough to be accepted in a bigger applicant pool as well. And those numbers hold true. If you look at the percent of students accepted after a deferral, Notre Dame has 9%, but University of Virginia, less than 3%. So that is, and really for out-of-state students, it's less than 2%. So if you get deferred from a school, I always say, you know, don't count on that as an option. Don't hold out for it and try to move on, but you'll never know. You might still get accepted. So now we're going to look at the regular, not necessarily the regular decision data, but the overall data, because the regular decision data hasn't been parsed out yet. So for looking at application numbers, this is a very also data heavy slide. But what I did was I sorted it in order from lowest increase in applications to biggest increase in applications, going left to right. So you can see on the left, Bowdoin over the last 2 years has only seen a 0.5% increase in applications, whereas Colgate has seen 146, so 2.5 times the amount of applications that they saw before COVID. So a huge increase. And what's really interesting is they're both small liberal arts colleges in New England, you know, in northern cold rural areas. Bowdoin's not quite as rural as Colgate, but so it's interesting that they're kind of similar institutions, but yet really drastic increases in numbers. So then you can see colleges with higher increases between the 2024, 2025 application cycles, that's last year, tended to see smaller increases this year. And then the University of California or University of Southern California and Johns Hopkins were the only colleges to see decreases in applications at all. So, and that's just this year. Everyone else has seen an increase in applications this year. So numbers are still continuing to increase, sometimes at really, really dramatic rates. But going back, just so you can see, you know, schools like MIT, Colgate, you know, these schools, I mean, all of these schools are highly selective schools. I'd say less so University of Santa Cruz, California, Santa Cruz, maybe UC Davis, but all of these schools are pretty selective, and you can see they all have pretty, I mean, really, other than Bowdoin, every one of these schools has seen over a 15% increase in applications, and a lot of them have seen, half of them have seen over a 30% increase in applications. So like I said, those top tier schools, those more highly selective schools are seeing those more drastic increases in application. So what are some of the outcomes and the trends? So this is where we kind of, you know, overall kind of similar to early decision, where because there's been more applications, and many times there's been more admitted students, but still a lower acceptance rate. And what's really interesting, and we talked about Northeastern, is last year they accepted, you can see it's quite, of all the schools that accepted more students than less, there's 3 that accepted more than 1,000 more. There's Northeastern, University of Virginia out of state, and University of Georgia. Northeastern is the only private school of those. It's definitely the smallest of those 3. So for them to be up there with that many more students that they accepted is really interesting. And I almost think I think it could be, this is maybe conspiracy theory of mine, but they have been known to game the ranking system in the past. And so they may have thought, okay, how many students could we accept? but still lower our acceptance rate, which they did. They decreased their acceptance rate last year by 1%. And then because they over-enrolled last year, whether this was intentional or not, this year they couldn't accept as many students, and their acceptance rate actually plummeted to lower than many of the Ivies. So this is a school that went, yeah.
Joe, just for full disclosure, I am a parent with a student at Northeastern, and so I don't know this information
It's a
from
great
any
school.
Yeah, no, I don't. So, but I'm
I'm not
just
saying
saying,
anything about the quality of the school.
I'm just saying I know information honestly from the parents group. I'm not saying I have any direct information from the college itself. But last year, I do think what happened is actually they had a higher yield than they expected. And the reason why I say that is because they scrambled, and they're still scrambling just with housing. So I mean, I can't say for sure whether it was purposeful or not, but I just think that more students accepted than they anticipated. And so now they have to balance it out.
Which, to counter my previous statement, Northeastern is known for their co-op program, which provides students with externships, which is full-time internships over 2 or 3 semesters throughout their experience. It's a 5-year degree generally, but they graduate with a 1.5 years of work experience. And so in a pandemic where so many people are losing their jobs and there's, a recession, that could be something that students, wanted to go to Northeastern to be able to graduate with that job experience. And so that could be a reason that their yield was much higher last year. Whatever the reason, the yield definitely impacted this year's admissions numbers, which fell dramatically, like I said, to that of an Ivy League school and those very top tier schools. So it's been very interesting to see, no matter what the reason. But a really excellent option, which has become very, very highly competitive. Okay, so liberal arts colleges, similar trends. So here, the number of students may have increased, but the overall acceptance rates have decreased due to those increased numbers. So you can see overall everyone's acceptance rates have decreased, even if they are still accepting a few more students. So overall, we're seeing those trends, just not quite as dramatically. It's also a little bit more certain this year. Last year, there were some that were higher, some that were lower, the numbers. This year, we're seeing a little bit more certainty, which is good. So waitlist. So if you don't, let's say, it comes to this time, March, you're getting your acceptances and you you don't necessarily get accepted, but you don't get denied, you get waitlisted, and basically what colleges do is, because of their yield, they're unsure of how many students are going to accept their offers. They hold some students on the side to see if they don't make their numbers, can they go to that wait list and accept students? These wait lists are not ranked. So it's not like, okay, I'm number 1 on the wait list. Let's say there's, they accepted 5 students from Nebraska and nobody from Nebraska decides to enroll, then they'll go to their Nebraska wait list and accept a student from there. So it's all about fulfilling institutional needs and shaping the incoming class. So 16% of the admitted students overall were admitted for University of Virginia were put on the wait list. They don't delineate whether it's in-state or out-of-state. For Notre Dame, it's 12%. They're the only schools so far that have said what their waitlist numbers are. So most schools are not very transparent about that as well, although they are later on. So the common data set is a set of data that is sent out that most of the colleges fill out. And that data is what goes to a lot of the guidebooks, which we use in College Insights. And they have hundreds of different data points. And one of those data points are, students that are waitlisted. So they do tend to be a little bit more transparent later on, but they are not necessarily right now. So test optional, we talked about that a little earlier. Our colleges truly test optional. So once again, there are not that many colleges who are fully transparent about their test optional admissions statistics. As you can see overall with the 3 that have reported, there are, there's a higher percentage of students who applied without test scores, so applied test optional, than with test scores. And then if you look, So of the students, so for Fordham, for example, 65% of students applied without test scores. Only 50%, 57% of the students that were accepted submitted, didn't applied test optional. So that's less. So you would hope that if you're truly test optional, that 65% of the students accepted applied test optional. And as you can see, those that applied with tests, only 35% applied with tests, but 43% of the students accepted were accepted with tests. And this is across the board. So Fordham actually more of their students were accepted that applied test optional, but if you look, still there was more of an advantage. There was a higher percentage of students who were accepted that submitted test scores than actually applied with test scores.
So this is just a sampling, you know, I mean, these are just these three schools who were, you know, willing to be transparent enough to share all of the information, and they shared the information, and the data does show that there is an advantage at these three schools. If you sent in your test scores, that you probably had a higher possibility of being accepted. But that being said, and Rebecca will say this too, that there is a correlation between students who are submitting their test scores are probably stronger candidates than the students who are not submitting the test scores. So,
and that's not to say everybody, because there certainly are strong students who are not good test takers, but there is a strong correlation between strong test takers and strong students. And so, these numbers, while they may seem skewed, might not be quite as skewed as they appear, or quite as unfair as they might appear. But Fordham, certainly out of the three schools, definitely seems to be the most test optional, in the sense that they actually still did accept more students who applied without standardized tests.
And this doesn't mean that just because your student has a test score, and their test score actually might be that they're going to have the advantage. It's really that that they have a test score. The test score is probably on the stronger side, and they have a good application. So that's why, all of those pieces come together, and they probably, in that case, would have a better advantage to submit their test scores and be accepted.
Yeah. And that is something we talk about, and something you can utilize College Insights for. We actually on College Insights post the average SAT and ACT score, and then also the 75th percentile. And what that does is it kind of gives you an indicator as to, if you're above that average or above the 75th percentile, whether you should submit the test scores or not. If you're below the average, I'd say for test optional schools, don't submit them unless it's a very specific circumstance. But for the most part, if you're above the average, then it's more likely to help your application. Definitely if you're above the 75th percentile. Okay. So demographics. So I compared this to the US Census data, which I thought was interesting. So if you look right here, you can see, and it was hard to kind of compare the two, because US Census data, when you look at students that are white, that includes Hispanic and Latinx students, or people in general, whereas admissions breaks Hispanic and Latinx students out into different groups. So it's not quite equal, but still you can kind of get a feel for whether a school is representative of the general population or not. So you can see, that Bowdoin, 52% of the students accepted are minority students. And so that is definitely more than the general population. So that's good. They're definitely working towards equity and, closing the socioeconomic and education gap between minorities and, white people. And so you can see at the school, the various schools, how they're doing. You could see that Notre Dame, 41%. So all of these, University of Georgia, so the public schools, and that might be more reflective of Georgia's population, although I know Georgia does have a lot of minorities, although they also have a lot of historically Black colleges there as well. So maybe that's drawing some more of the African-American students. But it's also interesting just to look at the international populations at these schools, all pretty significant international populations as well. And these are these aren't the acceptance rates, by the way. These are the percentage of the students within the admitted applicant pool. Parents' education. So this is something I find really interesting. So when colleges, these colleges reported, what percentage of their freshman class were first generation college students. And so that means that neither of the parents attended college. And so I compared this to the overall population. So I looked at the data, I don't know if it's census data or another data from the Department of Education. 62% of the adult population 25 and over in the country does not have a college degree. And then if you compare that to the percentage of students accepted who had neither parent go to college, you can see that it's still not representative of the population, but it has increased over previous years. So you can see that 12% of University of Georgia's class is our first generation compared to Swarthmore and Wellesley. Swarthmore, a third of the class are first generation college students. So you can see they're really working towards that equity to try to help rise the education gaps. And then another interesting thing, Notre Dame, you can see they're the only ones that reported legacies. Notre Dame is notorious for being for favoring legacies. They're very vocal and proud of being kind of giving advantage to their legacies and having higher acceptance rates for legacies. They actually have more legacies in their first year class than first generation college students. So more people whose either parent or grandparent, I think actually with Notre Dame, it might even just be their parents that they report. They have like 2 different degrees of legacies that they report or that they consider. And they have more students in their first year class whose parents went to Notre Dame than students whose parents didn't go to college at all. And then when you look at public versus private schools, so these are the schools that the sending high schools of the students that were accepted. And so 90% of, so I think it's important when looking, you see, okay, 58% of Bowdoin students, 66% of Swarthmore students come from public schools. You say, great, that's more than half. But when you compare it to the 90% of students coming from public schools nationwide, it's not representative at all. So there's definitely a big advantage for students who come from private schools. And that could be for a number of reasons. It could be the smaller class sizes, the more individualized attention that students get might especially match the learning experience at some of these smaller liberal arts colleges. They might be interpreted to have stronger curriculum and better education. And they also have people like myself, college counselors who help support the students within the application process and teach them and kind of help them do all the things that we help you do here in the Road to College Concierge program. And so that's something where there is a significant advantage to attending a private school over a public school, even though it might not look as clear here. If you compare it to the regular population, the numbers are significantly higher from private schools. So what does all this data, I just gave you a ton of data. What does it all mean? And I've said some of this and I'll repeat some of it, but the selective colleges, the most selective, are becoming even more selective. So at higher rates than those that are less selective. So overall, selective colleges in general, everyone with acceptance rates, under 50 are becoming more selective, but the more selective you are, it just gets exponentially more selective. So lower acceptance rates, and that's because lower acceptance rates encourage students applying to the top schools to apply to even more to increase their chances. People say at this point, you never know what the admissions officers are thinking, what they're looking for. Somebody might, at one of these top schools, an admissions officer might read your application, at one point be in a good mood and look at it more favorably than they are, later in the day, when they maybe are hungry and haven't eaten and just want to rush through the application. You never know what the situation is. You also never know how the colleges are shaping their class, what specifically they're looking for. And so because of this uncertainty, especially at these more highly selective schools, people are throwing, these students are throwing more applications out there to even more highly selective schools, thus making the problem worse. So really the biggest implication there is to really include target and likely options in your list and really prioritize finding good target and likely options. There's so many amazing target and likely options. All these, if you notice, the colleges that we talked about today are really, a lot of them are repeated from slide to slide, and they're just the most highly selective. There's so many colleges out there that are missing from this slideshow, and they don't really report their numbers like these other colleges do. And there's so much more admissible. There's so, even in the top 50 or 75 colleges or national universities on the US News rankings, there's some very attainable colleges on that list. So it's really just the top 20, 30 colleges, 50 colleges and universities in the country that are this highly selective. So that being said, there's still, things are calming down. There is less uncertainty. So I was saying last year that this year would be predictably unpredictable, and it's becoming a little bit more predictable. So applications will continue to grow, but at slower rates. Admits will continue to drop, but at slower rates. That's what we're seeing happen this year. And thus, with things kind of calming down, colleges will be able to better predict their yield rates, unlike Northeastern last year, whatever the reason was. And that will lead to more certainty on both ends in subsequent years. So, I do see things calming down, unless we have another huge pandemic, but hopefully we're good for right now. Test optional. So it kind of goes both ways. We are seeing an increasing number of schools going test optional. Like I said, the Georgia Public University, just other than the top 3 most selective, just went test optional this past week. Also in the past week or so, California State University system went permanently test blind. Previously, they were testing out their test blind pilot along with the University of California. Now they are permanently test blind. And prior to COVID, we're seeing an increasing number of selective small liberal arts colleges go test optional. So even the ones that went test optional because of COVID probably were moving in that trend anyway, because their peer institutions were already doing it. So those are, the Bowdoin, the Bates, the Colgate, all those schools that, the small Middlebury, Swarthmore, Haverford, Bryn Mawr, those small liberal arts colleges, most of them were already test optional, and those that weren't probably were going to move that in that direction soon. But on the other end, the top research universities are still showing they've, especially the private ones, are valuing those standardized tests. So, well, some publics as well. So Georgetown, very big fans of standardized testing. They technically did go test optional, but we're still very strongly considering people encouraging students to apply, to submit any test scores that they had. And we're encouraging students to still take standardized tests, even when it was potentially dangerous for them to do so during COVID. Georgia, University of Georgia, Georgia Tech, and all the other Georgia schools up until recently, they were not test optional. All the Florida Public, University of Florida, Florida State, they never went test optional. MIT just announced yesterday that they will require test scores for the class of 2027. So this is the first of the schools that had been test optional for the past 2 years to kind of say, all right, we're done. And they're citing that they've actually found that it is more equitable for them to look at standardized tests. There's been questions and critique from, I think, New York Times and some other, definitely in the college counseling community, as to whether their rationale makes sense and that it might not be backed up by data, but that's their decision. And as you can see in previous slides, they had some of the biggest increases in applications. So maybe they're finding that it's just too many applications. They don't need that many. They already have a strong applicant pool without test optional. They're saying it's better predictors, but so are Harvard and Yale. Harvard and Yale have both said that SAT and ACT are better predictor of their schools, of basically first-year student grades at their schools than high school GPA alone. So considering them together is a better predictor. But no news yet as to whether Harvard or Yale are going to, rescind their test optional plan. But as you could see, admit rates for test submitters are, higher. And then at some schools like Emory, Notre Dame, and Penn, they are actually double that of the acceptance rates are double that of the test optional applicants. So, whether it be correlation or they're not truly test optional, we don't know for certain. But if affordable, I do encourage you to consider some sort of test prep. There are free test prep opportunities online. There's Khan Academy and ACT Academy. Khan Academy links up to your PSAT scores and provides a game plan based off of your strengths and weaknesses there. But if you can afford a class or a tutor, the more individualized prep I've seen students get, the better their score, the score improvement tends to be. And that once again goes back to equity. So, those students who can't afford, this is the reason for test optional and the reason why so many in the college admissions landscape on both high school and college side are such proponents of test optional admissions, is because so many of the students who have those higher test scores have them because they were able to afford test prep in order to learn how to take the test. So much of taking the SAT or the ACT is just understanding how to take the test, not necessarily understanding the content. So with all of this in mind, some words of wisdom. So there's a college admissions counselor Facebook group, which has thousands of people like me who work on the high school side, people who work in college admissions, and also independent college counselors. And this one woman, Ashley Hare Casey, posted kind of a letter that she sent out to her students who were starting to hear these insane, once again, even lower acceptance rates and starting to be discouraged. And we wanted to share those words with you here. So one, you have the time, ability, and resources to put together a strong, clean application that tells your story. This will take time and effort, a few trusted extra set of eyes, and serious self-reflection. The elements need to work in harmony to paint the picture of you. And so, this is one of the things that we help you do, with the College Insights or with the Concierge program, is we really, have a timeline. We've kind of mapped out the ideal process of how we think, if you were to spread all the workload out and really put the time and attention into each thing, when you should start doing each thing. And we, put that into our concierge program. So you're getting relevant information at the time that you need to get it to kind of take your next steps within this process. So it does take a lot of time and effort, but if you spread it out, and it really can be helpful.
So the emphasis here is on time. And, as what I kind of say is, as time marches forward, it's not that things can't get done, is that potentially you kind of just lose options. So the options kind of narrow because maybe, your student just runs out of time putting all their applications together. You miss the deadlines because you didn't think about applying to that school. So I only emphasize that, obviously, it's the cliche comment, time is the most precious thing. And it applies here too, because, we can't go backwards. And so if deadlines are missed, you have to come up with a different plan. But you guys are somewhat lucky. I mean, there are a lot of families who started, earlier than this, but you still are at that point that you have enough time to get this done without going crazy.
Yeah. And I'm a big proponent of doing everything really early. I have, my seniors this year who were done with their main college essay by summer. Applying to college was a breeze for them. They felt no stress over applying to college. Maybe now as they're waiting decisions, but applying in the fall was, really nice, not a bad experience for them at a time when they have an increased rigor of curriculum senior year and a more leadership in their extracurriculars, as opposed to my students who did not work on their essays last year like I asked them to. I had some of my top students not do what I asked them to last year at the timeline that I suggested and push things off until even December, right before winter break, sending me essays and to review and look at. And those students were extremely stressed out. And so the earlier you can kind of do things, the better off you'll be, especially in terms of your mental health. You have the choice to take a rigorous schedule senior year that highlights your strengths and passions. Push yourself, but make sure the choices you make are ultimately for you, not for the college application. Sincerity matters. And so this is something we just did a workshop recently on selecting senior year courses. So if you sign up, you can definitely view that workshop and maybe advocate to take a more challenging curriculum, but do so in areas that you are passionate about, and don't do so simply for admissions, because students who I've seen take, more AP classes because they think it'll look better for college, but it's more than they really can really handle, end up not doing as well, and mid-year grades are sent to colleges. So that is important. You have the choice on how to spend your summer. This is the time to be a better version of yourself. So summer is a time you work really, kids work really hard during the school year. They should have some sort of a break in the summer, but not a complete break. Colleges like to see when you do things productive. Or if you don't do an activity or something, even just preparing for the next school year, preparing your academics can be advantageous. And we have a workshop on that as well, on things you could do over the summer. So, just other things to consider to help you prepare for that process. You have a choice of which college to apply to. Do the research and think about the specifics as to how you will fit and articulate it. Right. So a lot of colleges have why us essays. So, really do your research on why that school's a good fit. We have workshops on supplemental essays and how to do the research for the why us essays. It's a lot like applying to a job and writing a cover letter, indicating not only why you're interested, but why it's a good fit for both. Us is not them, us is we, me and them. So that's important to consider. Why are you a good fit for them? Why are they a good fit for you? Indicate interest. So, go visit colleges, do virtual tours if you can't visit them in person. Be strategic and realistic. So, listen to why your counselor suggests a school on your list. If your counselor does so, there's usually always a reason. I had a student today send me, I sent a list of approximately 30 schools to her that I thought she should consider. She's a very high need student. And she sent me a list of schools back that normally I would love to see from students. Normally, I'd like to see more target and likely schools. Students too often put too many reach schools on, but the schools she sent me don't meet a high amount of need, and she needs schools that meet more need. There's a reason I recommended those schools for her. So if a counselor recommends a school for you, consider the reasons why they recommend it. Be willing to add schools to your list that are strong fits, and that you have a greater chance of admission. Right? You want to make sure that you have options in the end. I always recommend at least 2 likely schools, at least 2 target schools, because that way you'll have options in the end and the decision won't be made for you. And then you also might have the opportunity to weigh financial aid offers as well. And I know we talk a lot about that in the concierge program. Be open-minded, fall in love with your likely school. So really, I can't encourage this enough. Too often we, look at reputation and just have these dreams of these schools, but sometimes the best fit schools aren't those schools. So really try to find reasons to fall in love with your likely or target schools, because then you will be satisfied with whatever the outcome. And it'll reduce a lot of the stress, because if you don't get into the reach schools, you don't get in. You still have a really great option. And also you can choose to cut out the chatter and the clutter. So focus on you. So often, people are worried about what other people might think, where other people in their school might be going, or maybe even get too many eyes. I had one student had like 5 people look at her essays, and every time it just got worse and worse and less her own authentic voice. Have a small group of people. I'd say, maybe 1-2 people max look at the essays. Don't have too many other people, look at the students' essays, because too many voices create too much conflict, and then it just ends up not being authentic. And set those boundaries. So those are some really good words of wisdom that she said. And then finally, this process, I think, as we've seen today, is it can be imperfect. It can certainly be unfair. And sometimes it can be rewarding. You put in a lot of work, and you might, do everything you can to present the best version of yourself, the most comprehensive full picture of yourself. And maybe that is enough to get you into the school of your dreams. Hopefully it is. So it can be really rewarding. And even if not, just even the process of doing it can still be rewarding. And you'll definitely grow in ways that you might not have imagined. And so, it's, was the saying, enjoy the journey, not necessarily the destination. There's definitely value to that journey. Okay, Debbie?
Yeah, well, just wanted to thank everybody for hanging in there with us. We were, it's been like an hour and a half, so hopefully you got a lot of good information. I personally like the way, Rebecca, you kind of summarized it at the end. The implications and these words of wisdom are really, they're really, really helpful. And so, again, just wanted to let people know that we're opening up the Concierge program, and if you wanted to join, we're giving a special $30 off, even if you join by tonight. This is just a perfect time. So let me tell you about what you get. So the session of what we had tonight is really just typical of the types of sessions we have monthly. And we probably have between 3 to 6 of these types of sessions on all the different topics that you could possibly imagine. You also get access to all of our past video. Everything that we do is recorded. If there's something you want to jump ahead and learn more about, you can go and look at what we did last year, or if there's something you missed, you can go look at all of the past recordings that we have. We also have a private Facebook group where we have a lot of the counselors and residents who work with us are members there, and they can answer any specific questions you have. The other big thing, and I don't know how many of you actually have tried it, is you also get free access to the College Insights tool. So it's really just included in this program. And the College Insights, Rebecca was mentioning all along, is really the data component to help you search and help you break down all of the admission rates and the merit scholarship information, and the 75th percentile test scores, and average GPA. So I kind of look at it as that's the quantitative side of doing your research, and then coming to all of these sessions and being able to ask your questions is the qualitative side. You need both. You need the numbers, and then there's so many nuances to the process that you need to be able to ask questions and talk to a professional, and even just hear other parents about what they're going through. You kind of need all of that information to really create the best, step forward or the best plan for your students. And then in addition, we actually do have what we call add-on services, if at any time, and I kind of call them as needed, because some people just use the Concierge and they do it all on their own, and they kind of use us as a support system. Other people need to, or they want to add on more specific information. So they, or services. They might want an extra hour here or there to help with essays, or just to even have a review of a college list, or to talk about their EFC or a financial aid appeal. So if there's any one-on-one extra help that you want, we have specific services. And as a member, you get an additional discount on those services, as opposed to just somebody who isn't a member and might want any of those services as well. So hopefully I answered a lot of questions as Rebecca was going through the program. And I'm just going to look through to see if there's anything else. Okay, so let me just, I'm just going to share this in the group, because somebody was saying that the link that I shared isn't working. So this is the link. If anybody wants more information about the Concierge program, maybe you could, somebody can give me a try and tell me if it is working. I looked and it is. So, if there's any other questions that you have, feel free to email me directly, and we will try and get your questions answered, and hopefully give you as much support as possible over the next few months. The summer is a perfect time to get a lot of this stuff done, because you just don't want to be in the position of next fall having to scramble. So I would say now is a great time to plan. summer is a great time to actually, execute, and then fall is a great time for your student to get back to school and maybe hopefully have this all behind them, and then they're just waiting for results. And as Rebecca said, I mean, she is even like further ahead of the curve. The students that she works with every day, they are, believe it or not, finishing up some of their essays now, which is just amazing.
That makes my job a lot easier. Not having it all packed into the fall.
Yeah. So thank you, everyone. I hope this was helpful. And I think that's it. That's all we got. Right? Anything else, Rebecca?
Nope, that's all.
That's it. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. We will send the recording, and we will see you around very soon in lots of different ways. Take care. Bye.